The blade slid between her ribs like it had been waiting there her whole life. She died on her knees in a hall of white stone, and the man on the throne, the man she'd given everything to, turned his face away. Then the light took her, and she woke, 7 years back, in a body without a single scar, in a bed she'd slept in as a girl, with a heart that already knew exactly how this story ended. She was 16 again, and this time she remembered every second of her own murder. The golden woman who'd smiled at her funeral. The cold king who'd signed her death without a word. The vow she swore to an empty room that she would never love him again. But something was wrong with the king. Something buried under 20 years of ice. A mark on his wrist spreading silver toward his heart. And the woman waiting in that palace had been there far, far longer than anyone knew. The blade went in the way a whisper does. Quiet, certain, almost gentle, as if the man who forged it had meant it to be a kindness. Sorcha felt the cold of it before she felt the pain. Felt it slide between 2 ribs like it belonged there, like her body had been built with a slot, waiting for exactly this. And she thought absurdly in the last clear moment she would ever have. So this is how it ends. Not in battle, not with her teeth bared and her wolf screaming, not defending anything worth dying for, on her knees. In a room built of white stone and colder silence. In the throne hall of Valengard, where she had once been called queen, she lifted her eyes because she could not help it. Because some ruined, stubborn part of her still believed that if he only looked at her, really looked, he would remember who she was. The woman who had poured her own life into his veins when the sickness in his blood tried to take him. The woman who had turned against her own father to prove she was loyal. The woman who had loved him past the point of sense. Varric did not look away, exactly. That would have required feeling something. He simply watched, his silver eyes flat as river ice in the dead of winter, his hand resting inside another woman's hand, as if it had always lived there. And beside him, golden radiant patient, as a spider at the center of her web. Solène smiled. Sorcha wanted to scream. I gave you everything. My magic, my family, my name, my soul. Only blood came. And the last thing she saw before the dark folded over her like a closing door was the Alpha King turning his face away, as though her dying were a small noise in another room, as though she had never mattered at all. Then light. Not the soft gray light of death she'd braced for. This was blinding, searing, wrong. It poured into the way flood water pours into a cellar, filling every hollow place, and she opened her mouth to cry out, and no sound came, except a gasp, a real gasp, a living one, the breath of lungs that worked. Sorcha woke. She woke in a bed she had not slept in for 7 years. She knew it by the smell of it. Cedar and old wool, and the faint sweetness of the dried lavender her mother used to tuck between the linens before she died. She knew it by the crooked seam in the canopy overhead, the one she'd stared at through 100 childhood fevers. She lay still, because if she moved, this might break. Because dreams of being alive were the cruelest kind, and she had learned not to trust anything that felt like mercy. Her hands came up in front of her face, small hands, unmarked. No scar on the left palm, where a council guard's manacle had bitten through to bone. No callus along the thumb from years of gripping a queen's ceremonial dagger. Soft hands, young hands, 16-year-old hands. And that was when she understood, and the understanding was so vast, it had no shape she could hold. She sat up. The room spun and steadied. She was in her father's house, in the Eastern Tower, in the body she'd worn before she ever stood in a great hall and let a beautiful monster take her hand. She had gone back. Somehow impossibly, and with no rule she could name to explain it, death had spat her out at the beginning. For a long time, she did not move. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, and her heart slamming, and her whole life, both her lives laid out inside her, like two maps of the same country, drawn by two different hands. She remembered the throne. She remembered the blade. She remembered the wedding and the lie of it, and the 5 long years she'd spent smiling in a court that was quietly deciding how to kill her. And she remembered his face turning away. Sorcha wiped her eyes with the heel of one small hand. When she spoke, her voice cracked, a girl's voice, unbroken, unruined. "I will never love him again." She said it to the empty room, to the crooked seam in the canopy, to whatever cruel or merciful thing had sent her back. "I will never let him near me, never let him claim me or break me or teach me to be grateful for scraps." Her hands closed into fists. "This time I choose myself." She meant it. She meant it the way only the newly dead can mean anything. Except the thing about vows, made in the wreckage of your own murder, is that they are easy to swear and terrible to keep. And fate, it turned out, was not finished with her. Fate had barely begun. 3 years passed. Sorcha did not spend them the way a heartbroken girl might. She did not weep into her pillow or write his name in the frost on her window, or wait secretly wretchedly for the future to arrive and prove her wrong. She had already seen the future. She had died in it. So instead she prepared. She learned to fight quietly in the gray hour before the household woke in the walled kitchen garden where the frost bit her bare feet, and taught them not to flinch. She learned the reach of a blade and the give of a throat, and the exact place under the jaw where a much larger opponent could be made to fold. She had been soft in her first life, trusting, desperate for love from a father who saw her as a coin to be spent, and a pack that saw her as a bargain to be struck. She hardened those soft places on purpose, one at a time, the way you'd file down a key until it finally fit the lock. But that is not the whole of what she did, and it is not the part that mattered most. Because there were others in her father's house who had it worse. Lord Hedrick kept servants, the way some men keep dogs they've stopped feeding. Omegas, mostly the lowest of their kind. Wolves born without the strength to shift into anything. A pack would value, treated as furniture that happened to breathe. In her first life, Sorcha had walked past them 1,000 times and seen nothing. A girl carrying water. A boy with a bruise. Background. Scenery. The furniture of a life she'd been too busy dreaming of a prince to notice. Not this time. Because she knew now what it was to be seen as useful and nothing more. To be a vessel, a source, an alliance, a glove worn until it wore out. And she could not walk past it any more. Which surprised her honestly. She'd expected to come back colder. She'd expected the grave to burn the softness out of her for good. Instead, it had done something stranger. It had turned her softness into a spine. So she started small. A crust of bread pressed into a thin hand. A word of warning before her father's temper turned. A wound cleaned and bound in the dark of the scullery, where a girl named Isolde had been beaten for dropping a tray and left to bleed against the cold stone. Sorcha knelt in that scullery with the girl's blood on her fingers, and she pressed her palms to the split skin, and she said the only useful thing she knew. You're not what he says you are. Do you hear me? You're not." And that was when it happened for the first time. A tingle. A hum. A sensation like static gathering in the tips of her fingers, like the air just before lightning. A pressure and a promise, both at once. The girl's wound was warm under her hands, warmer than it should have been, and when Sorcia lifted her palms away, the bleeding had slowed. Not stopped. Not magic, surely. She had no magic. She'd been tested as a child, and found empty an ordinary wolf with an ordinary soul, valuable only for her father's ledgers. She told herself it was warmth. Pressure. The body's own stubborn will to live. She was wrong, of course. But she wouldn't understand how wrong for a long time yet. Brindis found her there, kneeling in the blood and the dark. Brindis had been Sorcia's nurse once, and was now something between a servant and the last honest voice in the house. An old woman with a face like a walnut, and hands that had buried 2 husbands, and never once gone still. She looked at the girl on the floor. She looked at Sorcia's hands, and she did not ask the questions another woman might have asked. "You've a healer's touch," was all she said. "Your grandmother had it. Skips the ones who'd waste it, my mother used to say. Finds the ones who won't." "I don't have any gift," Sorcia said. Brindis only smiled the way old women smile at things they know better than to argue about. "Then you've got the next best thing. You've got the wanting to." Over those 3 years, Brindis taught her. Not spells. Brindis had no spells. She taught her which herbs drew the fever out, and which ones drew the poison, how to set a bone and stitch a wound and coax a frightened body back from the edge of giving up. And under the old woman's hand, Sorcia's odd warmth grew. She stopped calling it warmth. She started privately to call it the hum. She gathered them slowly, the ones nobody counted. A dozen souls at the bottom of her father's house, learning from a lord's daughter that they were worth more than their bruises. She taught them to stand straight when Hedrek's shadow fell across a doorway. She taught them to read. She taught them that no one got to decide their worth for them. Not a father, not a lord, not a king. And among them was Maelys. Maelys could not speak. A childhood sickness had taken her voice and left everything else a quick, dark mind, a watchfulness that missed nothing. Hands that could say more with a gesture than most people said in a speech. She had come to Hedrek's household by way of the royal court, sold down and down the ladder of the powerful, until she landed at the bottom in a lord's scullery, carrying the memory of things she'd seen in the palace of Valengard, that she had never been able to tell a living soul. Sorcia didn't know that yet. What she knew was that Maelys watched her with an intensity that felt like recognition, and that when Sorcia taught the others their letters, Maelys learned fastest of all, and that the girl carried a small oilcloth bundle against her chest, the way a person carries the only thing they have left. She would learn the rest of it later. She would learn it at exactly the moment it could save both their lives. For now, 3 years passed, and at the end of them, the harvest moon gathering came again. In her first life, she'd gone at 18. Breathless, bright, a lamb in a good dress walking into a hall full of wolves and thinking it was a ball. This time she was 19, a year older, a lifetime harder. And she stood before her mirror in the same tower room, and the woman who looked back at her was not the girl who had once existed. Her auburn hair fell in the old familiar waves. Her amber eyes held none of the old warmth. She had chosen the gown herself, silver and black, the colors of mourning, though no one in that whole gathering would understand who she was mourning, or why. She was mourning a woman who wasn't dead yet, herself. the soft hoping girl she used to be. Sorcha fastened the last earring. Her hand didn't shake. She'd made sure of that. "My lady," Brindis in the doorway, her old face careful. "Your father wants you below. The delegation from Valengard has arrived." The name landed in Sorcha's chest like a stone dropped down a well. Valengard, the White Towers, the cold light, the throne room floor where she'd bled out on her knees. She did not let it show. 3 years of practice, and she'd gotten good at not letting things show. "Tell my father I'll be down shortly." Brindis withdrew, and Sorcha stood alone a moment longer, breathing, gathering the ice around herself the way another woman might gather a shawl. She descended the stairs with her spine straight and her face carved from something colder than stone. The great hall was exactly as she remembered it. Nobles from a dozen packs in their best finery, all of them arranged like fruit in a bowl, all of them desperate to catch the eye of the visiting king. Candlelight and cold ambition and the smell of 100 people trying too hard. And at the center of it, surrounded by advisors and guards and lords who laughed too loudly at things he hadn't meant as jokes, stood Varric. He had not changed. I was tall the way a cliff is tall, something you looked up at and felt small before. Hair, the pale gold of winter wheat falling to his shoulders in a way that should have looked soft and somehow only sharpened everything else about him. Eyes like frozen lakes, gray and silver and empty of anything that could warm you. Beautiful. That was the trap of him, the thing they never told you, that a monster could be so beautiful. Your own wolf would strain toward him even as your mind screamed to run. And her wolf strained. Damn it it did. Some traitor part of her soul remembered his scent, his hands, the weight of him on a wedding night when she'd been foolish enough to believe he was hers. She crushed the feeling the way you'd crush an ember before it could catch the whole house. "Daughter." Lord Hedrick appeared at her elbow. His grip on her arm was too tight, the way it had always been too tight, a man handling merchandise he was afraid might wander off. His smile was the one he wore for people he wanted something from. "The king has asked to be presented to you. Do not embarrass me." In her first life, those words would have made her frantic to please. She'd have smoothed her skirts and lowered her eyes and prayed to be worthy. Now they only reminded her cold and clear that her father had never once loved her. That he'd watched her execution 7 years and a lifetime from now, and gone home, and slept soundly. "Of course, father," she said, smooth as glass. He steered her through the crowd. The nobles parted like water, and she let herself be delivered, walked hand to elbow, straight to the wolf, who would one day nod along, while a council ordered her death. Varric turned as they came. For one moment their eyes met and the whole world narrowed to a point. He looked at her the way he had the first time. She knew that look. She'd spent 5 years learning to read the small country of his face, and she recognized the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost invisible tilt of his head, a predator catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. His gaze moved over her, her face, her gown, the way she held herself, cataloging, weighing. In her first life, that look had made her blush and duck her head, giddy with the impossible thought that the Alpha King had noticed her. Now it made her want to show him her teeth. "Your Majesty." Hedrick bowed low. "May I present my daughter, Sorcha." She curtsied. The movement was flawless and completely without warmth, a thing done correctly and meant to insult by its very correctness. She kept her eyes down, not from shyness, because she didn't yet trust herself to look at him without her face betraying 7 years of grief. "Lady Sorcha." His voice rolled over her like winter fog off a lake. Deep, cold, and so achingly familiar, it was almost obscene. "I've heard a great deal about you." She lifted her eyes, met his, steady. "Have you? Your Majesty, I can't imagine what." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe. In her first life, she'd been all grateful stammering. This was not that. "Your father speaks highly of your spirit." Sorcha nearly laughed. Her father had never spoken highly of anything about her, but her marriage price. "My father is generous with his words," she said flatly. "He spends them the way he spends everything, on whatever profits him." A ripple went through the nobles nearest them. This was not how girls spoke to kings. Hedric's fingers dug into her arm hard enough to bruise. "Sorcha!" he hissed. But Varric raised one hand, and the whole small storm went still. His eyes had not left her face. "Believe us," the king said. It was not a request. Hedric hesitated only a breath before he released her and backed away, and the other nobles flowed back with him, leaving a wide ring of empty floor around Sorcha and the man who would murder her. Her wolf paced inside her. Restless, wrong-footed. This was the moment she knew it in her bones in her first life. This was where he'd smiled and offered his hand and asked her to dance, and she had thought it was the beginning of a fairy tale. It had been the beginning of a grave. "You're not afraid of me," Varric observed. "Should I be? Most people are." She looked at him. Really looked for the first time, and let a little of the truth show at the edges of her voice. "Most people haven't watched you sign their death." It came out before she could stop it. Reckless, stupid, the kind of slip that got a girl noticed by exactly the wrong person. And she saw it register, saw the almost imperceptible shift in the air between them, saw his scent deepen with something that made her wolf want to bare its throat and submit. She refused. "A strange thing to say," he said slowly, "considering we've only just met. Recover. Recover now." "Forgive me, Your Majesty." She smoothed her voice back into something level. "I only meant that your reputation arrives before you do. They say you're colder than the mountain that made you, that you've never once shown mercy to an enemy. They say a great many things about me." He stepped closer, and she had to fight down every instinct that screamed at her to give ground. This close, she could smell him properly, pine and frost, and something darker underneath the scent that had haunted 7 years of nightmares, and still, God help her, called to the animal in her blood. "Most of them," he said, "are true. Then I'll be sure to stay out of your way." She stepped back, put distance between them, deliberate and cold. "I've no wish to become your enemy, Your Majesty." She turned to go. "Wait." The command in it was absolute alpha to the marrow, and her wolf froze her in place before her mind could override it. She hated that. Hated the way her own body still knelt to him. "I didn't dismiss you," Varric said. She turned back slowly. Her hands were trembling. She hid them in the folds of her skirt. "My apologies," she said, not sounding remotely sorry. "Was there something else?" He studied her a long moment, and then, inexplicably, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile. She'd never once seen him smile. Not truly. Not in 5 years of marriage. But the closest thing to it she had ever seen on that carved and frozen face. "Dance with me," he said. There it was. The same 3 words. The same beginning. The hinge on which her whole first life had swung. The hall seemed to lean in. The musicians faltered. Every noble who had been pretending not to watch stopped pretending, and Sorcha felt the vow rise up in her, the one she'd sworn to an empty room 3 years and a lifetime ago, and she let it out into the light where everyone could see it. No. The word dropped like a blade. Her father made a strangled sound somewhere behind her. Varric's almost smile vanished as if it had never been. No, he repeated, as if the word were in a language he didn't speak. No, your majesty. She curtsied again, sharp, final, a door closing. Thank you for the honor, but I must decline. And she did not wait for permission. She turned and walked away from the Alpha King of Valengard, through the middle of a silent hall, her heart pounding hard enough to crack a rib, his gaze burning into her spine like a brand pressed to skin. Her wolf howled somewhere deep inside her. Grief or triumph, she couldn't tell. She'd made it 3 steps when his voice reached her. Low, meant for her alone. No one refuses me, Lady Sorcha. She didn't turn around. Then I suppose I'll be the first. And she walked out of that hall and left the king staring after her with something in his silver eyes far more dangerous than anger. The reckoning came faster than she'd braced for. 3 days after the gathering, Sorcha was summoned to her father's study. She found Hedrek behind his desk, with his face the color of old ash, a letter shaking in his fist, and she knew before he spoke that she'd set something enormous in motion. Do you know what you've done? She closed the door. I declined a dance, hardly a war. He laughed, an ugly cracking sound. The Alpha King has called in my debts. The words hit her low and cold. What debts? All of them. He slammed the letter to the desk. Every gold piece I've borrowed from the crown in 10 years. Every favor. Every trade concession. Every payment I let slide. He wants the whole of it inside 30 days, or he seizes our lands and dissolves the pact. Her mind moved fast, mapping it against what she knew. In her first life, she'd never heard of any debts. But then, in her first life, she'd been too busy dreaming of a prince to notice the rot in her own house. How much? More than we have. More than we could raise in a year, let alone a month. And for the first time in either of her lives, she saw real fear in her father's eyes. He's going to ruin us, because you wouldn't dance with him. Part of her wanted to say, this is your rot, father, your greed, your ledgers. But she knew with a certainty that turned her stomach that Hedrek was right about the cause, even if he was wrong about the blame. Werewolf was doing this because of her, because she'd told him no. She had forgotten this about him, that in her first life she'd never once refused him anything, and so she had never seen what he did to the people who did. She was seeing it now. There must be a way to answer it, she said. Hedrek's laugh was worse this time. There is. He was good enough to include an alternative. He held out a second parchment, smaller, sealed with the king's own crest. Sorcha broke the seal with numb fingers. Lady Sorcha, you owe me a dance. I always collect what I'm owed. Present yourself at Valengard within 7 days. Come willingly, and your father's debts are forgiven. Refuse, and your whole pack learns the price of your pride. Verrick. She read it twice. Her blood went to ice. He wants you at the palace, her father said. As a guest, he says. We both know what that means. Yes. They both knew. He was summoning her into his court, into his reach, and using her family's survival as the leash. In her first life, she'd gone to him gladly, desperately, half in love before she ever arrived. Now he was giving her no choice at all, which was, she understood the whole point. He hadn't liked hearing no, so he'd built a world where she couldn't say it. "I won't go," she heard herself say. "You will." Her father's voice cracked like a whip. "I will not lose everything, because you decided to play games with the most powerful alpha alive. You don't understand what he'll do to me." It came out rawer than she meant it. "If I go to him. I don't care what he does to you." Hedrick's face twisted with contempt, so old and so familiar, it barely stung anymore. "You're my daughter. Your purpose is to serve this family. If that means warming the king's bed, you'll do it with a smile and thank him for the privilege." There it was. The truth of him laid bare the same man who would one day watch her die and never blink. She was not surprised. She'd known it since before she woke in this body. But knowing a wound is coming does not stop it from cutting. "Fine," she said, flat, empty. "I'll go." He sagged with relief, and the sight of it, his relief at selling her again, was somehow the ugliest thing in the room. She turned to leave, paused at the door, didn't look back. "Father, when this is finished, I want you to remember something." "What?" "That I remember everything." She left him with that hanging in the cold air behind her, and did not care what confusion it left on his face. But before she went, before the carriage, before the mountains, before the white towers, rose again out of her nightmares, Sorcha did one thing her first self never would have thought to do. She went down to the scullery, to the dozen souls who called her quietly, the only decent thing in that whole house. She told them she was leaving. She told them to keep their letters going, keep standing straight, keep believing what she'd taught them, no matter whose shadow fell across the door. And Melis silent, watchful. Melis caught Sorcha's sleeve as she turned to go. The girl's dark eyes were urgent. She pressed something into Sorcha's hands, fingers signing quick and insistent, a language the two of them had built together over 3 years of fire-lit lessons. "You go to Valengard. I know that place. I know its secrets. Take me." "I can't," Sorcha whispered. "It isn't safe. Whatever waits for me there, I won't drag you into it." Melis's jaw set. She shook her head once hard, and she signed one more thing slow enough that there could be no mistaking it. "You saved me. Let me be of use. Not because I'm useful, because I choose it." And Sorcha, who knew better than anyone alive what it meant to be told your only worth was your usefulness, and what it meant to finally choose your own felt something, give way in her chest, a wall she hadn't known she was still holding up. She looked at the small oilcloth bundle Melis always carried against her heart. She didn't ask what was in it. She wouldn't understand what it was until the night it saved them both. "All right," she said. "All right. You come as my maid. And Melis, you answer to no one there but me." The girl's face lit with something fierce and glad. And that, small as it seemed, was the first move in a war neither of them had fully begun to understand. The journey to Valengard took 5 days. Sorcha spent them in the carriage her father provided, watching the land change from the gold forests of home to the frost-bitten peaks of the north. With every mile the air grew colder. With every mile she drew nearer to the man who had killed her. She tried to plan, tried to build strategy the way Brindis had taught her to build a poultice ingredient by ingredient. But what strategy answered a king who held absolute power and had already proven he'd burn her family to make her come to heel? In her first life, she had loved him. That love had been a blindfold. She'd made excuses for every cold word, every silence, every time he chose the crown over her. She would not make those excuses again, but she couldn't simply refuse him either. He'd shown her the cost of that. Her pack, her people. Innocents who'd suffer for her defiance, and worse, she thought her father had a dozen souls in his scullery who had no protection at all if the crown came down on his house. So she would play a different game. She would give the Alpha King nothing. No warmth, no fear, no soft place to press. She'd be ice where she'd once been, firestone where she'd once been yielding, and if he wanted to break her, well. He'd already done that once. She knew exactly how it felt, and she'd learned the hard way that a woman who has already survived her own breaking is not so easy to break twice. The palace rose on the evening of the 5th day. It came up out of the mountains like something winter had carved for its own amusement. White stone towers reaching for a gray sky spires sharp enough to cut cloud. Windows glittering with a cold that had nothing to do with the sun. Even from the valley road, she could feel the power breathing off it. She had lived there once. She had been happy there for a little while in the way a bird is happy in a gilded cage before it understands the bars. And she had died there on her knees on the white floor of the throne room. The carriage stopped at the gates. Guards in silver and black surrounded it at once, their wolves watching her with a predator's idle interest. Lady Sorcha of the Hedrek pack. The head guard checked her papers unhurried. You're expected. The king left orders you're to be brought to him at once. Of course he did. Sorcha stepped down into the bitter cold. She'd dressed in deep burgundy, the color of dried blood, her hair bound severe and high to sharpen the lines of her face. She looked nothing like the blushing girl who'd arrived here in her first life to be married. Good. Let the whole cold palace see exactly what had come through its gates. The guards walked her in through corridors she knew too well. Past the great hall where she'd danced at her own wedding. Past the council chamber where they'd condemned her. Past the royal apartments where she'd given herself to a man who'd one day turn away while she bled. Each hallway was a small knife. She let none of them show on her face. They stopped at last before doors she didn't recognize. The king's private study, the guard said. He's waiting inside. The room beyond was warm. That was the first surprise warm, when the rest of the palace breathed frost. A fire roared in a great hearth. Books climbed every wall. And there, by the tall window with his back to her, stood Varric. He turned as she entered. In the firelight he looked almost human, almost soft. The flames caught in his pale eyes and threw the warmth back and, for one treacherous heartbeat, her wolf stirred with something that felt sickeningly like longing. She crushed it. She was getting good at crushing it. Lady Sorcha. His voice was silk laid over steel. Welcome to Valengard. Your Majesty. She curtsied precise as ever, though I don't recall being given much say in coming. No. He gestured to a chair by the fire. Sit. We have a great deal to discuss. She stayed standing. I'd rather stay where I am. I don't intend to be here long. Something shifted in the air, that predatory stillness. She remembered the sense of standing in a room with something old and patient, and entirely without mercy. You misunderstand your situation, he said quietly. You are not here as a guest. You are here because I willed it, and you will stay precisely as long as I please. And how long is that? He crossed the distance between them in 3 unhurried strides, close enough that she could feel the cold rolling off his skin, smell the winter and the pine and the dark thing underneath. She did not move. She had promised herself she would never flinch from him again, and she kept that promise, even as her wolf whined. "Until I understand," he murmured, "why you out of every wolf in my kingdom had the gall to tell me no." She met his eyes without blinking. "Perhaps I simply saw you clearly." His hand came up. She braced for a blow, old instinct first, life instinct, but his fingers only grazed her chin, tilting her face toward the light. "And what do you see? A murderer," she thought. "A man who will one day sit on his throne and let a woman he claims to love bleed out on the floor." But she could not say that. Not yet. Not ever, maybe. "A king," she said instead. Nothing more. Something flickered in the silver. She couldn't read it. She'd never been able to read him that had been half her ruin. "You'll dine with me tonight," he said. "Not a request. And tomorrow. And every night after, until I decide otherwise." "And if I refuse?" His smile was winter itself. "Then your pack learns I keep my promises. All of them." He released her chin and stepped back, gesturing to the guard at the door. "Show her to her chambers, the ones adjoining mine." Her blood ran cold. Adjoining his. Close enough that he could reach her in the space between one breath and the next. Close enough that she'd never once feel safe. She followed the guard out without letting her face move. And it was there on the threshold that the second shock of the night found her. Footsteps in the opposite corridor. Light, feminine. Trailing a scent like honey and wild summer flowers, a scent she knew. A scent that had smiled at her funeral. Sorcia turned. A woman stood there. Golden-haired, beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, all clean lines and cold promise. Eyes the blue of a summer sky, and a mouth curved into a smile that dripped sweetness like a wound drips honey. Solène, the woman who would steal her husband. The woman who would forge the letters and whisper the lies and orchestrate her death. The woman who had watched her die and smiled the whole way through it. She was here. She was here now, and that was the thing that stopped Sorcia's heart in her chest, because in her first life, she had not laid eyes on Solène until 2 years into her marriage. 2 years. Back then, the woman had arrived as a stranger, a distant cousin from a minor house, seeming as surprised as anyone by the pull between herself and the king. But here she was already at court, already close to Varric, already smiling. The timeline had moved, and Sorcia understood with a lurch of pure cold dread that whatever advantage she'd thought she carried, her memory, her foreknowledge, her map of a future that had already happened, that advantage was gone. This was not the story she'd died in. This was something else, and she had no idea yet how much else. And she was walking into it, blind. Solène's eyes found her. And for one terrible instant, something flickered there. Recognition. Gone as fast as it came, buried under the honeyed smile. "Oh," Solène said, her voice light as spun sugar. "You must be the new arrival. The little wolf who refused to dance with our king." She laughed, and it was silver bells and something rotten underneath. "How delightfully bold. I do hope we'll be friends." Sorcia looked at the woman who had murdered her, and she smiled back. It cost her everything she had, and she smiled. "I'm sure we will be," she said. "The very best of friends." The words tasted like poison. But she'd learned a life she'd already spent that the most dangerous wars are fought behind smiles. And this time she would not be the one who lost. Except Solène did not simply glide away the way she had in Sorcia's imagining of this moment. She lingered. She tilted her golden head, and her summer blue eyes moved over Sorcia's face with a slow, deliberate curiosity, the way a person studies a portrait, that reminds them of someone they can't quite place. "Have we met?" Solène asked softly. "You have the strangest look about you, as if you'd already made up your mind about me." "Careful, careful now. I've only just arrived, my lady. We couldn't possibly have met." "No," Solène agreed, but she didn't sound sure. "No, I don't suppose we could." She smiled again, and this time it did not reach her eyes at all. Still, a word of kindness won newcomer to a wiser friend. The king is a complicated man. His affections run in channels carved a long time ago, longer than you've been alive, little wolf. Don't mistake his attention for anything warm. He's been mine since before you drew your first breath, and he'll be mine long after you've gone home to whatever pack sold you to him. His since before you drew your first breath. Sorcha felt the words and hold. In her first life, this woman had played the newcomer a stranger to the king. This Solène spoke as if she'd owned him for 2 decades. "You speak very freely," Sorcha said, "for someone I've only just met." "I speak freely," Solène said, "because I've watched 100 girls just like you come through those gates thinking they were the exception. They weren't. He collects clever things and grows bored of them. You'll last a season, perhaps 2. She reached out and appallingly intimately tucked a loose strand of Sorcha's auburn hair back into place, the gesture of a friend of an older sister of a spider, testing a strand of its own web. "I only tell you so you don't break your heart on him. Consider it the first gift of our friendship." And she swept away down the frost-lit corridor, honey and rot trailing behind her, leaving Sorcha standing very still, with her heart pounding and her whole careful map of the future in ruins at her feet. Because everything was different now. The woman who was supposed to arrive in 2 years was already here. The stranger who was supposed to seduce the king had just claimed to have owned him since before Sorcha was born. And if that was true, if Solène had been in Varric's life that long, then nothing. Sorcha thought she knew about her first death was the whole story. She had come back believing she understood her enemy. She understood nothing. The guard cleared his throat. "My lady, your chambers." Sorcha followed him past the door that adjoined the king's into a room that smelled of the same lavender her mother used to press between the linens a lifetime ago. She sat on the edge of the strange bed. She looked down at her small, young, unscarred hands. "I choose myself," she'd sworn to an empty room 3 years back. "I will never let him near me." And here she was, adjoining his door, dining at his table by dawn, with a murderer smiling in the corridor and a mute girl asleep in the servants' quarters, carrying a bundle of secrets neither of them had opened yet. The vow rose up in her again, frayed at the edges now, harder to hold. "Not this time," she whispered to the cold room, to the future she no longer recognized, to the girl she used to be. "Whatever this is, whatever game she's playing, whatever's wrong with him, and something is wrong. I feel it. I'm not the lamb anymore." She pressed her hands together and felt the faint hum wake in her fingertips, that static promise she still didn't understand. "This time," she said, "I choose." Outside her window, the white towers of Valengard cut the darkening sky like teeth. Somewhere below, a king with ice in his veins sat alone in a warm room, wondering why one small wolf's refusal had lodged in him like a splinter. He couldn't work free. Somewhere else, a golden woman was already planning her next move. And in the servants' quarters, Melis lay awake in the dark, one hand curled tight around an oilcloth bundle she had carried out of this palace once and sworn she'd never carry back. The game had barely begun. But this time, Sorcha thought, closing her eyes this time, at least she knew there was a game. And she meant to win it standing up. The first dinner was the worst kind of torture, the kind that wears a smile. Sorcha had braced for cruelty. She'd dressed for it black again, defiance stitched into every fold, and descended to the small dining hall, expecting the cold king of her memory. The one who looked through her. The one who spoke to her the way a man speaks to a fine horse he's decided to buy. Except that was not who was waiting for her. Werewolf rose when she entered, which he had never done in 5 years of marriage. Not once. And he pulled out the chair at his right hand himself, waving off the servant who lunged to do it, and he watched her cross the room with an attention so total it made her skin prickle. "You wore black again," he observed. "I find it suits my mood, Your Majesty." "And what mood is that?" "Mourning." She waited for the flash of temper, for the cold. Instead, the corner of his mouth did that thing again, that almost lift, that ghost of an expression she'd never once earned in her first life. "For whom, my freedom," she said, "recently deceased." And he laughed. He laughed low and startled, as if she'd reached into his chest and struck a bell he'd forgotten he owned. The sound of it turned every head at the table. It stopped the servants mid-step. Because Sorcha would learn this slowly over the coming weeks from frightened maids and careful glances. The Alpha King of Valengard did not laugh. Ever. And here he was, laughing at a girl in mourning black who'd just told him to his face that he was her murderer, more or less, and meant it. Her wolf the traitor warmed at the sound. She hated her wolf. "Sit, Lady Sorcha," he said, still with that ghost of warmth on his mouth. "I promise I've no plans to have you executed before the soup." And her whole body went cold and still, because he could not have known. He could not possibly have known what those words did to her. He was joking, a dark, careless joke the kind, powerful men make when they've never once been on the wrong side of a blade. And she had died on that blade. On her knees. In a room 3 doors from where they now sat. She sat. She picked up her spoon. Her hand did not shake, and she counted that a victory. "You went pale," Varric said quietly. "Watching. Always watching." "Why, in the cold of this place," she said. "It gets into the bones." It was not a lie. It just wasn't the truth, either. The days settled into a shape after that, and it was not the shape she'd expected, which was the thing that frightened her most. Each morning, she was walked through the frozen gardens by guards who pretended they weren't watching her count the exits. Each afternoon, she was permitted the library, and she spent those hours the way a drowning woman spends her last air hunting through crumbling texts for anything. Anything about the mark she'd glimpsed once on a king's wrist in a life she wasn't supposed to remember. And each evening, she dined with Varric. She'd thought the dinners would be a performance. 2 enemies circling a table each, waiting for the other to slip. That she could have managed. She'd trained for that. What she had not trained for was conversation, because he asked her things. Real things. Not the empty pleasantries a king tosses at a subject to fill silence, but questions, sharp, curious, genuinely interested. He asked what she read. He asked whether she preferred the mountains or the sea, and when she said the sea, he asked why, and he listened to the answer as if it were a thing worth keeping. He asked her opinion on a trade dispute along the southern border, and when she gave it carefully sideways testing, he argued with her. Not to crush her, to sharpen the point, as if her mind were an opponent worth meeting. In 5 years of marriage, he had never once asked her the name of her favorite season. Now he seemed to want to know everything, and the wanting was so unlike the man she'd buried her love inside of, that it undid her a little more each night. "You're frowning again," he said on the 5th evening. They were alone as they always were. Now the court had learned fast that the king did not welcome interruption during his hours with the strange wolf in mourning black. I'm thinking. About what? The truth was about you. About why you're not the man who killed me. About whether this is a mask, another trap, a longer game than the one I've already lost. About the fact that my wolf leans toward you every time you laugh, and I would rather die again than let her. About home, she said instead, which was at least not nothing. Do you miss it? No. The honesty of it seemed to catch him off guard. Then why the frown? Because I don't understand why I'm still here. She set her fork down. You've had a fortnight to decide whether a minor lord's daughter is worth royal attention. Surely that's answer enough. You're not a minor lord's daughter. He said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. Certain. Immovable. You're the least minor thing that has walked through those gates in a very long time, which is precisely the problem. She let that pass, without showing what it cost her to hear it. Something in the way he said a very long time snagged at her the same stretch of years. So Len kept reaching for that boundary. They both seemed to live inside, without either of them naming it plainly. She filed it away. She was getting good at filing things away. Your Majesty, Varric. She blinked. What? We've dined together 6 nights. He leaned back in his chair, firelight softening the hard planes of his face into something dangerously approachable. I think we're past titles. Call me Varric. I don't think that's appropriate. I'm the king. I decide what's appropriate. There was no arguing with that, and they both knew it. But the name felt like a door she couldn't afford to open. Intimate. A wall lowered by exactly 1 stone. And walls, once you started removing stones, had a way of coming down all at once. Varric, she said carefully, testing the shape of it in her mouth. It tasted like grief, like a wedding night she wished she could forget. Like his name gasped against his throat in a dark she'd been fool enough to trust. Something moved in his expression. Satisfaction, or hunger, or something with no clean name. Again, he said quietly. No. For a moment the air between them went taut as a bowstring, and then he smiled, the small real one, the one that made him look years younger, almost like a man who'd once been a boy, who once knew how to be happy. And he said, you are the only soul in this kingdom who tells me no. Do you have any idea how starved I've been for it? I imagine it's maddening. It should be. He tilted his head, studying her the way she kept catching him, study her like a puzzle he couldn't stop turning over. Instead, I find I can't stop thinking about it. There was the pull again. The same magnetic, treacherous pull that had drawn her under in her first life, that sense that fate itself was leaning on the scales. She'd believed it then. She'd drowned in it. She would not believe it now. She rose from the table. I should return to my chambers. Running. Retreating. With strategy. Same thing. She was almost to the door when his voice caught her. Softer than she'd ever heard it. Sorcha. She stopped. Did not turn. You asked why you're still here. The truth is, I don't know. A pause. She heard him stand. I only know that when I look at you, I feel as though I've been looking for you my whole life. As though you're the answer to a question I never learned how to ask. Her heart clenched so hard it hurt, because those were almost his exact words from her wedding night. Word for cursed word. The night she'd believed herself the luckiest woman in the world. Except he'd said them differently then. Rehearsed. Smooth. Pretty things poured over a pretty bride. Like wine over a stone. Now they came out raw. Confused. As though he genuinely did not understand his own heart, and was frightened by what he'd found in it. Which was the difference. Which was the whole terrible difference, and she was only beginning to understand what it meant. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said, and she fled before he could take the wall down any further. That night she dreamed of her death, the way she still did, the way she supposed she always would. The throne room, the chains, the white gown already going red at the breast. The council's verdict, ringing off the cold stone, treason, conspiracy, betrayal of the crown. Every word of it a lie. And Varric on his throne, with Solen's hand possessive on his arm, his face as blank and pale as a frozen lake. "Please dream," Sorcha begged. "Please just look at me. You know me." "The sentence will be carried out at dawn," said the king, and there was no recognition in him at all, except. And this was the part the dream always circled back to the splinter. She couldn't work free. Just before the blade, just before the dark, she had seen something move behind his eyes, something that did not match the cold. A flicker, a crack, something that might have been agony quickly drowned. She woke gasping, tears on her face, and lay in the dark of a room 3 doors from the man who'd condemned her, and she let herself think a thought she had spent 3 years forbidding. What if he hadn't wanted to? What if the man on that throne had been screaming somewhere behind his own eyes while his mouth pronounced her death? No. That way lay ruin. That was the old sickness looking for the crack, the excuse, the reason to forgive him. She'd loved him into her own grave once on exactly that kind of hope. She would not do it again. She got up, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, and she went in the gray hour before dawn to find the one person in this whole frozen place who was truly hers. Melis was already awake. Of course she was. Melis was always awake. The girl slept the way prey sleeps in fragments and are always turned to the dark. She sat by the low fire in the servants' quarters with her oilcloth bundle in her lap, and when Sorcha slipped in and sat beside her, she didn't startle. She only looked with those quick dark eyes that missed nothing, and she signed a single question. "Bad dream." "The usual one," Sorcha murmured. Melis nodded slowly, and then, after a long moment of the two of them watching the fire, she did something she had never done in 3 years. She unwrapped the bundle. Sorcha had never asked what was in it. She'd meant it that day in the scullery. The girl's secrets were her own to keep or give. But now in the gray cold, Melis laid the oilcloth open across her knees, and inside was a book. Small, water-stained, bound in cracked leather, its pages swollen and warped as if it had once been soaked and dried again. A journal, and on the first page in a cramped and fading hand, a name Sorcha did not recognize, and a date that made her go still because it was old. Older than Sorcha, older by the look of it than the king. Melis's hands moved. "I served here, in the palace, when I was small. Before my voice went, I saw things. I was invisible to them, a mute scullery child, furniture that breathed. So they let me see everything." Sorcha's breath came shallow. "What things?" Melis touched the book. Her fingers were trembling just slightly. "There is a woman here. Golden. Beautiful. She has been at the king's side since he was a boy, and she is not what she pretends to be." Sorcha felt the whole cold room narrow to the fire, and the book, and the girl's trembling hands. "Solène," she breathed. Melis nodded once hard, and then she wrapped the book back up and pressed it to her chest and shook her head. "Not yet." The gesture said, "Not yet. I'll show you when it's safe. When I'm certain, when I understand what I'm giving you." Because whatever was in that swollen little journal, Melis had carried it out of this palace once, and sworn never to bring it back. And she was not going to spill it into the gray dark on the strength of a bad dream. But she'd shown Sorcha it existed. And that was a thread. And Sorcha had learned in a life she'd already spent that you win these wars by threads. The library gave her the next one. She'd stopped expecting much of it. She'd read through half the wretched place, and found nothing but genealogies and trade law, and the endless dull record of a kingdom's paperwork. But that afternoon, wedged behind a row of ledgers, as if someone had hidden it, and then forgotten, she found a slim black volume on the old forbidden magics, and in it, sketched in faded ink, a mark, pale, intricate, almost like a brand, a pattern of interlocking lines that coiled in on itself like a serpent swallowing its own tail. And her blood went to ice because she'd seen it before. Once, on a wrist, in firelight. In a moment she wasn't supposed to remember, when a king had reached for her face, and his sleeve had slipped, and she'd caught a glimpse of something pale against the skin of his inner wrist, and thought nothing of it. Because in her first life she'd never once thought to look. She read, "The Thrall Seal. Among the most forbidden workings known to wolf or witch, it binds not merely a subject's power, as a common binding does, but their will, their choices, the very shape of what they believe to be true. A skilled caster may make a man forget what he has done and remember what he never did. He may be given a past that is not his own and made to live inside it, cold and obedient, for years, decades." Her hands had gone numb around the book. The seal must be constantly renewed. The subject will suffer moments of clarity, his true self surfacing brief and bewildered, but a caster of sufficient skill will keep these episodes short, confusing, easily dismissed by the subject as fantasy or dream or madness. In time, the working turns upon its host. It feeds, it draws life from the one it holds, and the drawing shows as fine lines of silver spreading beneath the skin out from the mark and toward the heart. When the silver reaches the heart, the host dies, and the caster walks free, wearing whatever face the world has learned to trust. Sorcha sat very still in the cold light of the library, because she was thinking of the dinners. The way he laughed when she defied him, startled, delighted, as though happiness were a language he'd half forgotten. The way he'd said, I feel as though I've been looking for you my whole life, and it had come out raw and confused instead of smooth and false. Those were his true self surfacing. Brief, bewildered. She was almost sure of it now, and she was thinking of her death. The flicker behind his eyes. The agony, quickly drowned. What if the man on the throne had been screaming inside his own skull while his body obeyed a command that was never his to give? "Oh," she whispered to the empty library, to the swollen book in the servants' quarters, to 7 years of grief she'd built her whole self around. "Oh, what did she do to you?" She had to be sure. She could not build a war on a sketch in a forbidden book and a hope she didn't trust. So she went looking for the proof on his own skin. She found him at dawn the next day in the training yard. I was alone, stripped to the waist despite a cold that would have killed a lesser wolf driving a blunted sword into a practice post with a brutal mechanical precision that had nothing of joy in it, and everything of a man trying to outrun something inside his own head. Sweat sheened his skin, and even from across the yard she could see what she'd come to see. The mark, dark on the inside of his wrist, and spreading out from it faint but unmistakable in the pale morning light, thin lines of silver threading up beneath the skin of his forearm, reaching toward his heart like frost creeping across a window. The seal wasn't only controlling him, it was killing him. Slowly, had been killing him for years, drawing his life a little at a time to fuel its own working. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. He'd scented her. "Neither should you. It's below freezing. The cold doesn't trouble me." "No." She stepped into the yard, watching those silver lines pulse faintly with every beat of his heart. "It doesn't, does it? It should. A wolf your size in weather like this, you should be shaking. But you're not, because it's already in you. The cold. It lives in your bones because something put it there." He went absolutely still. Then slowly he turned to face her, and his silver eyes had gone flat and dangerous. "How do you know about the mark?" Not a question. A warning. She could have lied. She'd rehearsed a dozen lies. "My grandmother was a healer. I saw it in a book. I'm curious about old magics." But she was so tired of lying, and time was so short, and there were silver lines crawling toward this man's heart, while a golden woman smiled in the corridors and waited for him to die on her schedule. So Sorcha crossed the frozen yard until she was close enough to touch him, close enough to see the exhaustion carved under his eyes that she'd mistaken for years for coldness. "Because I've lived this before," she said. Silence. "I don't understand," Varric said slowly. "I know." She took a breath. She'd debated this moment through 100 sleepless nights, whether to tell him whether he'd think her mad, whether she was throwing away her only advantage. But she could not stand in this yard and watch him die a second time, behind a face that wasn't even allowed to be his own. "I know it sounds impossible. I need you to listen anyway. Please." Something in her voice, the grief in it, the plain, unhidden grief, made him go quiet. "Speak," he said. So she did. She told him. Not all of it, not the ball, not the wedding, but the shape of it. That she had lived a life before this one. That she had known him in it. That she had loved him, and served him, and given him everything she had. That a golden woman had come to court and slowly, patiently turned the whole world against her, with letters that were forged and accusations that were false. That she had knelt on the floor of his throne room and felt a blade slide between her ribs while he watched with ice in his eyes and never said a word. And that she had woken 3 years ago in a younger body, with every memory intact, and a vow to never let him near her again. When she finished, his face was the color of bone. "You're telling me," he said, and his voice had gone strange and low, "that we were married, that I had you killed." "Yes, that's not possible." "I know." He turned away from her, ran both hands through his sweat-damp hair. She watched the muscles of his back coil like a creature preparing for a blow. And when he spoke again, it came out in fragments, a man assembling a horror one piece at a time. "If what you say is true, then everything I remember, my whole life." He stopped, started again. "It might not be mine at all." "No," she said softly. "It might not." He spun back. And there was something new in his face now, not disbelief. Worse than disbelief. Recognition. The look of a man who has just been handed a name for a thing he has felt clawing at him in the dark his whole life. "There are gaps," he said, barely above a whisper. "There have always been gaps. Days I cannot account for. Decisions I made that I would never that make no sense to me when I go looking for the reason. I told myself it was the burden of the crown, the curse in my blood. I told myself a king does hard things and forgets them because he must." His hand had come up to the mark on his wrist without his seeming to notice fingers pressing against the pale pattern, as if he could feel now the thing that lived beneath it. "I have felt for as long as I can remember as though I were watching my own life through a fogged window, and I never once let myself ask why." "Because the seal doesn't let you ask," Sorsha said. "That's how it works. The question itself gets fogged over before you can finish thinking it." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd walked back into this palace, he looked at her without the king in the way. Just a man. A tired, frightened, half-drowned man, surfacing for the first time in 2 decades. "Who did this to me?" he said. She didn't answer at once. She was thinking of the corridor, of honey and rot, of that same stretch of years reached for twice now by 2 different mouths that shouldn't both have carried the weight of it. "Who has been at your side the longest?" she asked gently. "Longer than any advisor, longer than any guard. Who came into your life before you were king, before your father died, and never left, and always, always seemed to be there at every turning point, every hard decision, every death." She watched the answer arrive in him, watched it land like a stone through ice. "No," he said, but it had no strength in it. "Varric. She's been with me since I was a boy. She's the one constant thing in my whole—" He stopped, and she saw him hear himself. The one constant thing, always there. "That's not comfort," Sorsha said quietly. "That's a leash." He sat down. He simply sat right there in the frozen yard on the cold stone bench by the weapon rack as if his legs had stopped agreeing to hold a lie that heavy. And she watched the most powerful alpha in the known world put his face in his hands and shake. And she understood that she was watching a man grieve a whole stolen life in the space of a single breath. She should have felt triumph. She'd come back for exactly this, to see him brought low, to see him suffer even a fraction of what she'd suffered. That was supposed to taste sweet. It tasted like ash. Because she knew, now watching him break, that the man who'd ordered her death and the man shaking on this bench were not the same man. One had been a mask. The other had been screaming behind it the whole time. And her heart, her stubborn, twice-broken heart, would not let her hate the one who'd been screaming. Which was a problem. Which was in fact the exact problem she'd sworn in a cold, empty room 3 years ago never to have again. "Why?" Varric said into his hands. "Why would you tell me this? In the life you say we shared, I killed you. Even if she, I was still the one on the throne. I still watched. Why would you come back and try to save the man who did that?" There it was, the question she'd been avoiding since the moment she felt the hum wake in her fingers, and understood she might actually be able to fight this. She thought about it. Really thought. She had spent 3 years hating him, building walls, sharpening herself into a blade with his name on it. She had come back to refuse him, to wound him, to walk away clean this time, and let him rot in the cold he deserved. Except that was before she'd seen the silver crawling toward his heart. Before she'd heard him laugh like a boy who'd forgotten how. Before she'd watched him break apart over a life that had been stolen out of his own skull one day at a time for 2 decades by a woman who smiled while she did it. "Because you weren't the one who killed me," she said. "Not really. And because in my first life I never got the chance to save you. I was too blind to see the truth until the blade was already in my chest." She crossed the yard and knelt in front of him in the frost, so he had to lift his face out of his hands and look at her. "This time I see clearly, and I am not going to let her win, not because of what she owes me, because of what she stole from you." For a long moment, he only looked at her, and then slowly he reached out, and his fingers found hers where they rested on his knee, and he held on to her hand, like a man holding on to the one solid thing in a flood. "How do we break it?" he said, which was the wrong question to be caught asking, because someone was listening. They should have known. Sorcha would berate herself for it later. An open training yard at dawn. 2 people speaking the one unspeakable truth aloud. But grief makes you careless, and hope makes you louder than you mean to be. And neither of them saw the golden shape watching from the shadow of the colonnade until it was already too late. Because that afternoon, Solène summoned Sorcha to the solar. Alone. In her first life. Solène had never approached her directly until the very end, when the trap was already sprung and the jaws already closing. Their whole friendship had been slow, gradual, engineered to make Sorcha trust her utterly. But this life had moved faster than the last everything, sliding forward on a timeline she no longer recognized, and here was the Golden Woman requesting her presence, as though the mask had stopped being worth the effort. She knows Sorcha thought dread pooling cold in her stomach. She saw us. She knows I've found her out. And she's going to move against me before I can move against her. The solar was flooded with pale winter sun. Solène stood at the tall window, the light turning her golden hair to a halo, looking every inch the angel she'd spent a lifetime teaching a kingdom to see. "Lady Sorcha," the honeyed smile. "Thank you for coming. I thought it was time we spoke. Truly spoke, just the 2 of us. About what, my lady? About the king, of course." Solène gestured to a chair. "Sit. I promise you'll find it enlightening." Sorcha stayed standing. "I prefer honesty to comfort." "What do you want?" Something flickered behind the summer blue eyes. Annoyance, maybe. Or the small recalculation of a predator discovering the prey has claws. "Very well." The sweetness dropped from Solène's voice like a shed skin. "I want to know who you really are. Because no minor lord's daughter looks at me the way you do. No stranger arrives at this court already knowing which battles to fight and which to yield. And no ordinary girl kneels in a frozen yard at dawn, holding the king's hand, whispering to him about breaking things that were never hers to touch." So, she had seen. Sorcha kept her face still with everything she had, but her heart was slamming. "You look at me." Solène went on, stepping closer, her scent shifting from honey toward something with rot beneath it. "As if you know me. As if we've met before. As if you hate me for things I haven't done yet." A cold smile. "It's a very particular look. I've only ever seen it on the faces of people who know exactly what I'm capable of. And I've made very sure that list is short. Careful. Careful she's fishing. She doesn't know she's trying to make you flinch into confirming it." "Perhaps," Sorcha said evenly, "you simply remind me of someone who hurt me once." "Interesting." Solène tilted her golden head. "And does the king also remind you of someone?" The king reminds me that power without conscience is the most dangerous thing in the world. How philosophical. Solène turned to the window, her back to Sorsha, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and certain and cold. Let me be direct, little wolf. Whatever game you think you're playing, whatever plan you've smuggled in behind those clever amber eyes, it will not work. Varric is mine. He has been mine since before you were born. I have poured the better part of my life into what I've built here, and I will not lose it to a girl who was sold to me by her own father. What exactly, Sorsha asked very quietly, is your relationship to the king? Solène turned, and her smile was triumphant. I was his first love, she said, before his father forbade the match, before the old fool made his son set me aside and marry politics instead. I was sent away, but I was never gone. I came back the moment the old king was in the ground, and I have been at Varric's side ever since, patiently, quietly taking back what was always mine. The words hit Sorsha like a blow, but not the way Solène intended, because Solène thought she was wielding a love story. His first love wronged and returned, and Sorsha, standing there with a forbidden book's warning still fresh in her mind, heard something else entirely underneath it. She heard a confession dressed as romance, set aside, sent away, came back when the old king died, at his side ever since, taking back what was hers. The old king had forbidden the match, and then the old king had conveniently died. And a golden woman had come back and spent 2 decades standing beside a man whose own life he could not account, for whose memory was fogged, whose wrist bore a mark that fed on his heart. His father, Sorsha said slowly. The old king. How did he die? For just an instant, the barest flicker, something crossed Solène's beautiful face. And then it was gone, smoothed back under the honey. A hunting accident, she said. So tragic, so sudden. She smiled. Why do you ask for no reason? Sorsha said. You simply seem to have benefited from it enormously. The temperature in the solar dropped. Solène's smile did not waver, but her eyes went to chips of blue ice. You should be careful, she said softly. What you seem to notice, little wolf. Girls who notice too much have a way of not lasting the winter here. I've watched a great many of them come and go. She glided toward the door and paused beside Sorsha, close enough to murmur it against her ear. He will never love you. He cannot. Whatever warmth you think you've coaxed out of him at that table, I own the man beneath it, and I always have. You've caught his eye for a season. Remember that, and remember that seasons end. And she was gone, honey and rot trailing behind her, leaving Sorsha alone in the flooded winter light with her heart pounding and a terrible new shape forming in her mind. Because it was worse than she'd thought, far worse. She'd come into this believing. Solène was a schemer who'd seduced a king and poisoned him against his wife. A social climber, a rival, a woman with a knife made of whispers. That was the enemy she'd died to, but that wasn't it at all. Solène hadn't seduced Varric. She'd stolen him whole from the inside before he was even king. She'd likely killed the father who'd tried to protect him. She'd worn a kingdom's trust like a stolen coat for 2 decades. And every cold word the king had ever spoken to Sorsha, every silence, every turned-away face, every nod that sent her to her death, none of it had been him. All of it had been the golden woman ruling a kingdom through a mask made of a living man. And here, at last, Sorsha understood the thing that had been snagging at her since the first night. In her first life, Solène had played the newcomer, arriving late, feigning surprise. hiding the truth of how long she'd truly been there. She had been in the palace the whole time. She had simply had the patience to stay in the shadows and let the years do her work. This time the timeline had shifted, and Sorcia's refusal had rattled something loose, and the spider had been forced out into the open before she was ready. That was the one advantage Sorcia had left. Not foreknowledge. Surprise. She had made the enemy show her hand. Sorcia sank into the chair she'd refused to sit in. And then, because she was Sorcia, because grief had made her a healer instead of a killer, because she could not seem to stop seeing the whole of a person, even when the person was her enemy, she found herself thinking a thought she did not want. How does a woman become this? Nobody is born a spider. Somewhere once Solène had been a girl, sent away by an old king, set aside like a thing of no value. Sold perhaps the way girls in this world were always being sold, the way Sorcia's own father had sold her twice. And something had curdled in her. Something had taught her that the only way to never be discarded again was to seize control so absolute that no one could ever set her aside. It didn't excuse her. Nothing excused a stolen life and a murder dressed as an accident, and a blade in an innocent woman's chest. But it explained the shape of her, and it frightened Sorcia in a way Solène's cruelty never had. Because Sorcia understood, sitting alone in that cold, bright room, that the Golden Woman was not so different from what Sorcia herself might have become. A girl the world called worthless. A girl sold by her own blood. A girl who died with a blade between her ribs and came back with nothing in her heart but the promise to never ever be helpless again. She had come back for revenge. She had sworn it to an empty room. And here now, she saw with terrible clarity where that road ended in a golden woman with rot beneath the honey, ruling a stolen life alone in her own beautiful winter. That's the version of me she can't see coming, Sorcia thought. Not the wolf who wants to kill her. The wolf who refuses to become her. She would break the seal. She would free Varric. She would drag the truth into the light of that throne room where she'd died. All of that, yes. But she would not become Solène to do it. Whatever waited at the end of this, however sweet the vengeance offered itself, she would find the thing that was harder than vengeance, and she would choose it instead. She just didn't know yet how much that choice would cost her, or how soon she'd have to make it. That evening, she went to Milas. The girl took one look at Sorcia's face and set down the mending in her lap, and reached for the oilcloth bundle without being asked. She'd been waiting. Sorcia understood, waiting to be certain, and whatever she'd read in Sorcia's expression had finally made her certain. Milas unwrapped the swollen little journal. She opened it to a page near the middle water-stained and close-written, and she pressed it into Sorcia's hands, and her own hands shook as she signed. I served the woman who wrote this. She was the old king's healer. She knew what the Golden One was. She was going to tell the old king everything, how the mark was set, how the boy prince was taken, how it might be undone. Sorcia's breath stopped. Might be undone, she whispered. There's a way. It's written here how to break it. Milas nodded. Once. Hard. Her eyes were bright with 3 years of held-in terror and held-in hope. She never got to tell him. She died first. Another accident. But she gave me the book because I was small and mute, and no one would ever think to search a scullery child. She told me to keep it until someone came who could use it. Someone who saw the invisible people. Someone who was not afraid of the Golden One. Maelis pressed her trembling hand flat against Sorcia's. I have waited my whole life for that person. I think it was always going to be you. Sorcia looked down at the book in her hands. The water-stained, warped, impossible book carried out of this palace by a silent child and carried back in against every instinct of self-preservation, because a dying healer had asked her to keep faith with a stranger not yet born. And she understood that everything she'd done in 3 years, every crust of bread, every wound bound in the dark, every whispered, "You are not what he says." You had been leading, without her ever knowing it, to this. To a girl no one wanted, holding the one key that could unmake the whole long lie. The invisible people, the ones the powerful stepped over. They'd been holding the answer the whole time in a scullery in the dark, waiting for someone to finally look. "Thank you," Sorcia whispered. And she meant it in a way she had never meant those 2 words in either of her lives. "Maelis, thank you for choosing to be seen." The girl smiled, small, fierce, glad. And outside the frost-rimmed window, unheard, the wind was already carrying smoke, because Solène did not wait to be certain the way Maelis had. Solène had seen a girl in mourning, black kneel in a frozen yard, and hold the king's hand, and whisper about breaking things. She had heard that same girl ask in a sunlit solar exactly how the old king died. And a spider that has spun for 20 years does not wait to see whether the fly has truly found the thread. It burns the web and begins again. The first scream tore through the palace an hour before midnight. And when Sorcia ran to her window and saw the east wing wrapped in flame green, flame, unnatural witchfire that water would only feed, she understood that the quiet war was over. The loud one had begun. The witchfire burned green against the black sky, and green fire tells no lies. It doesn't crackle warm like a hearth. It hisses. It reaches. It gives off a cold, sickly light that makes every face it touches look already dead. Sorcia ran. She ran through corridors filling with smoke, past servants fleeing in every direction, past guards shouting orders that contradicted each other, past centuries of white stone learning, for the first time, what it was to burn. The east wing was a wall of green flame, and she understood with a certainty that turned her stomach what was housed in the east wing. Solène's chambers. 2 decades of a spider's work. Every thread, every anchor, every scrap of evidence that a forbidden thing had ever been done to a boy who grew into a king. She's burning it, Sorcia thought. Whatever she used to set the seal. Whatever proof survives. She's putting it all to the torch before I can drag it into the light. Except the one thing that mattered most was not in the East Wing, because Maelis had carried the healer's journal out of this palace years ago and carried it back in against every instinct that screamed at her not to. Because a silent scullery child had kept faith with a dying woman's request across a whole lifetime. The book. The water-stained, warped, impossible book that held the how of setting the mark and the how of breaking it was not burning. It was in the servants' quarters, wrapped in oilcloth pressed to the chest of a girl no one had ever thought worth searching. Solène could burn her whole web. She could not burn the thread she'd never known existed. Sorcia found Maelis in the smoke-choked corridor outside the servants' hall, the bundle clutched to her heart, her dark eyes streaming from the fumes, and something fiercer than fear. The girl grabbed Sorcia's sleeve and signed, fast and desperate, "I have it. I have it. Go. Find him. Break it. I'll keep this safe with my life. Not with your life, Sorcha said, gripping her thin shoulders. You've spent enough of yourself keeping other people's secrets. Get out. Get to the gardens away from the smoke, and you keep breathing. That's an order from your lady. Do you hear me? And Melis, who had been told her whole life that she was furniture that happened to breathe, heard herself given an order that valued her life above the book she carried. She nodded. Once. Her chin trembled. Then she pressed the oilcloth bundle into Sorcha's hands, because Sorcha would need it, and they both knew it, and she fled toward the gardens, the way a person flees who has finally been given a reason to survive. Sorcha turned toward the courtyard, toward the green light, toward the golden woman she knew would be waiting at the center of it, because a spider always returns to the center of its own web, even when the web is on fire. She found Varric first. I was in the smoke, half-dressed, a sword bare in his hand, and he was fighting something invisible. She saw it before she understood it, the king of Valengard on his feet, but swaying his whole body, locked in a war with itself. One hand rose to grip the sword. The other clawed at the mark on his wrist, as if he could tear it out of his own flesh. The silver lines under his skin had gone bright. Feeding. Solène was pulling on the leash from wherever she stood, and 2 decades of obedience were dragging at him like a riptide. Sorcha. He got her name out through his teeth. I can feel her in my head. She's trying to make me... His arm jerked. The sword rose an inch toward her, and horror flooded his face. Get away from me. Get away, I can't be sure I won't. You won't, Sorcha said, and she did not step back. Look at me. You're fighting it. In my first life, you didn't even know there was anything to fight. You do now. That's already a battle she's losing. His arm shook. The sword trembled in the air between them, and then with a sound like a man breaking his own bones, he forced it down. Go to her, Sorcha said. I'll be beside you. We end this tonight. They came into the courtyard together. Solène stood at its center, and she was not alone. A ring of soldiers surrounded her, and Sorcha's stomach dropped because they wore the king's silver and black, but they did not stand like the king's men. They stood like hers, positioned between Solène and the world, their loyalty plain in every line of their bodies. 2 decades was long enough to place your own people in every corner of a kingdom's power, to dress them in a king's colors, and forget they'd ever answered to anyone else. Varric, my love. Solène's voice carried over the hiss of the flames, calm as a woman greeting guests. I wondered when you'd come, and you brought the little wolf. How fitting. I do so like an audience when I clean house. It's over, Solène. Varric's voice was raw, but it held. Whatever this has been, whatever you've done, it ends now. Done, she laughed, and the sound was nothing like the silver bells Sorcha remembered. It was cold. It was cruel. It was the laugh of a woman who had waited half her life to stop pretending. My darling, I have barely begun. This isn't the end of my work. This is the moment it finally comes into the light. She lifted her hand, and on her wrist, catching the green fire, was the mark. The twin of the one that fed on Varric's heart, the caster's anchor. The other half of the working worn openly now, because she was through hiding it. Did you truly think, she said, that I would let them marry you off to some pale political nobody all those years ago? You were mine. Your father saw to it that we were parted, but he could never stop me from taking back what was always meant to be. He only delayed me. Varric went very still, and Sorcha watched the truth arrive in him the way a wound arrives first, the impact, then a half-second later, the pain. My father, he said, The hunting accident. Solen's smile was a blade. I was getting close. She said it lightly, as if she were recalling a small inconvenience. The old fool and his healer whispering in corners. He was going to find the mark. I was going to tell you what I'd done, and worse, how to undo it. I couldn't allow that. A shrug, elegant and horrible. So I allowed him a hunting accident instead, just as I'll allow your little wolf a tragic death in tonight's fire. Whatever's left of her, they'll find in the ashes. There it was. The murder of the old king, confessed to his son's face as casually as a woman remarking on the weather. And Sorsha felt Varric's grief crash off him in a wave. A father's death handed to him whole in a burning courtyard by the woman he'd been made to call his beloved. You killed him, Varric breathed. I freed you, Solen corrected. He was the only thing standing between us. And now, at last, she raised her marked wrist, and dark power began to gather around her fingers like smoke pulled backward into a fire. There is nothing standing between us at all. Kneel, Varric. The word landed with the full weight of every year she'd owned him. And Varric dropped. His knees hit the courtyard stone. His face contorted with agony, every muscle straining against a command, woven into the very meat of his mind, and he could not rise. Sorsha lunged toward him, and the soldiers moved to block her, closing the ring, cutting her off from the man buckling on the ground. You see, Solen walked toward him slowly, savoring it, drinking it down. Every cold word he ever spoke to you, that was me. Every time he turned away from you. Every alliance, every enemy destroyed, every death sentence signed. She reached down and cupped his straining face with something that looked obscenely like tenderness. I have ruled this kingdom from behind his eyes his whole life. He is not a king. He is a mask, and I am the face beneath it. Then why do you need him at all? The question cracked out of Sorsha before she'd finished thinking it, and it stopped Solen cold. Because it was the right question. She could feel it land. If you're so powerful, Sorsha pressed, if you can bring the Alpha King to his knees with a word, why hide? Why all these years behind a mask? Why not simply rule? Solen's beautiful face tightened. Because power without a crown is a target, she hissed. A witch queen would be hunted, feared, torn apart by the very people she ruled. But the beloved queen of the great Alpha King, the tragic first love, reunited at last with her soulmate, that is a story a kingdom will kneel to. That is a story that keeps me safe forever. Her eyes glittered green in the firelight. I don't want the throne, little wolf. I want to never be discarded again, and a face the world loves is the only thing that has ever kept anyone safe. There it was. The whole rotten heart of her spilled out into the burning night. To never be discarded again. Sorsha heard it, and something in her went quiet and sad and certain, because she knew that fear. She had worn that fear. It had ridden her out of her own grave 3 years ago, with a vow of vengeance on her lips. Who discarded you? Sorsha asked. Softly. Not a weapon, a question. For one heartbeat, just one, the golden mask slipped, and underneath it, Sorsha saw not a spider, but a girl. A girl sold and sent away, and set aside a girl the powerful had stepped over. The way powerful people always stepped over the ones they'd decided were worth nothing. A girl who had swallowed that lesson so deep it had rotted her from the inside out. Everyone, Solen said. And then the mask came back down, harder than before, because she had let herself be seen, and it terrified her. Enough. She turned to her soldiers. Kill her. Make it look like the fire took her. The soldiers advanced, and Sorcha, who had spent 3 years learning the reach of a blade in a frozen kitchen garden, who had hardened every soft place on purpose, one at a time, did not freeze the way the girl she used to be would have frozen. She moved. She ducked the first grasping hand, drove her elbow into a throat, sent a man twice her size folding to the stone exactly the way Brindis had taught her they would fold. But there were 6 of them, and one of her, and a blade caught her across the arm, opening silk and skin in a bright line of pain. Sorcha, Varric's voice anguished, still pinned on his knees by a single word. She stumbled back, blood dripping from her forearm, and thought clear and cold and almost calm. This is it. This is how I die again. Not on a throne room floor this time. In a burning courtyard in the ashes made to look like an accident. She'd changed everything, and she'd changed nothing. Solène always won. Solène had always won. And then she felt it. A warmth in her chest. Not the small hum in her fingertips she'd carried for 3 years. Something vast. Something waking. A power she'd thought she'd lost when she died. Not lost. Sleeping. Gathering. Growing this whole time, feeding not on cruelty. The way. Solène's magic fed, but on every crust of bread and every bound wound and every whispered, "You are not what he says you are." 3 years of choosing compassion over vengeance, and it had been building something in her the whole time, brick by patient brick, and she had called it warmth because she hadn't dared to call it what it was. The power surged up and out of her, and when she thrust her hands forward, silver flame erupted from her palms. The soldiers scattered. Silver fire carved through the green, and it was not hot. It was cold. A clean, bright, freezing fire, the essence of a northern winter, turned into a weapon. The same cold that lived in Varric's bones, but turned toward mercy instead of control. Sorcha stood at the center of it, and felt it answer her like a thing that had always been hers, and only been waiting for her to become worthy of it. Solène staggered back, and for the first time in either of Sorcha's lives, the Golden Woman's composure cracked all the way through. "You have no magic," Solène breathed. "I checked. I made certain. You were empty." "I was empty," Sorcha said, and her voice rang with something vast. "In my first life, I died empty. But I came back Solène, and I didn't come back the same." The silver flames rose around her, throwing back the green. "You built your power on taking, on theft and murder and a whole stolen life. I built mine on the opposite. Every person you'd have stepped over, I picked them up, and they're the reason I'm still standing." She turned her head just slightly toward the king on his knees. "Varric, can you hear me?" A groan. His head lifted. His whole body shook with the effort of fighting a command carved into his bones. "I can't rise," he gasped. "She's the seal. You can." Sorcha kept her eyes on Solène, whose dark power was gathering again, thick and rotten. "She's held you your whole life, but she never once managed to destroy who you really are. I've seen him. I've seen the real you in the way you laughed at my table when nobody living has made you laugh in a decade. In the way you looked at me and forgot to be cold. Those weren't slips, Varric. That was you, fighting to the surface, reaching for something true across all those years of fog." The silver fire blazed brighter. "She can command your body. She cannot command your heart. She never learned how, because she's never had one of her own to practice with." Touching, Solène snarled, and she flung her hand forward, and dark magic roared across the courtyard like a wave of night. But sentiment won't save either of you. This seal has drunk 20 years of power. You have no idea what you're facing. Neither do you, Sorcia said, and she thrust both hands forward, and silver met black in the center of the burning courtyard. The impact was a thunderclap. It threw soldiers off their feet. It shattered every remaining window in the east wing. The very stones of the courtyard cracked and groaned beneath them. But Sorcia held. She planted her feet in the trembling ground, and she poured herself into that silver fire, and she thought of everything of loving Vaeric in her first life with the whole of her open heart, and having it thrown back at her on the point of a blade, of dying with the cold spreading through her chest, of the girl in the scullery whose wound she'd bound in the dark, of Melis pressing an impossible book into her hands, of a golden woman who'd once been a discarded girl and had chosen at every turning to become the thing that had hurt her. I will not, Sorcia thought, pouring silver into the dark. I will not become you. I will beat you, and I will not become you. That is the only victory that counts. And she felt a hand close around hers. Vaeric, on his feet. Somehow impossibly he had risen, his face gray with the effort, blood running from his nose, the silver lines under his skin flaring like struck sparks. But his eyes were clear all the way down his own, for the first time in 2 decades. You broke it, Sorcia breathed. The command, not broken, he said. Fought for you. Because there was finally something on the other side of the fog worth fighting toward. His hand tightened on hers. Together. Their power merged. Silver and ice twisted into something new. A fire so cold, it burned a frost, so bright it blazed, and it crashed into Solène's darkness, like a river breaking a dam. The golden woman screamed. The anchor mark on her wrist blazed white, and then split and across the courtyard. The twin mark on Vaeric's wrist shattered in a spray of light, the silver lines beneath his skin dissolving like frost under a morning sun. And Solène fell. She crumpled to the cracked stone, her stolen power, broken her long working. Undone her soldiers scattering into the smoke now that the hand that held their leashes had gone slack. The green witchfire guttered and began, at last, to die. Silence fell over the burning courtyard. Sorcia's legs gave out. Vaeric caught her before she hit the ground, pulling her against his chest, and she felt his heart hammering under her ear. A real heart, a free heart, beating to no one's rhythm but his own. You're alive, she whispered. It worked. You're free. Because of you. His voice cracked. Sorcia, I remember everything. The tears came then, tracking through the soot on his face. The wedding. Our marriage. Every cold word I ever spoke to you while I screamed behind my own eyes and couldn't reach you. His voice broke apart entirely. The end of it. I felt what they did to you as though it were done to my own body, and I could do nothing. Nothing but sit on that throne and watch the one person I loved be taken from me on the floor of my own hall. The one person he loved. Sorcia's twice-broken heart did something she had no name for a great, slow turning over. Grief and hope folded so tightly together, she couldn't tell them apart. You loved me, she said, from the first moment. At the gathering in your first life when you looked up at me across that hall. His hands framed her face, and they were warm now, finally warm. But she twisted it. Made me believe you were a convenience at best, a threat at worst. I fought so hard to reach you, and I failed. Every single time, I failed. You didn't fail. Her own tears fell now, and she let them. "You're here. You found your way back through a lifetime of dark. That's not failing. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." She should have felt triumph. She'd come back for exactly this, to see the golden woman broken on the ground, to take back everything that had been stolen to win. Except now came the part she'd been circling for 3 years, without daring to name. Because Solène was not dead. She lay on the cracked stone, her power gone. Her mark shattered her body, spent, but her chest still rose and fell. And her summer blue eyes were open, and they were fixed on Sorsha, with a look Sorsha recognized because she had worn it herself once, on a throne room floor at the end of a blade. The look of someone waiting to die, and certain they deserve it. Sorsha rose from Varric's arms. She crossed the courtyard slowly. The silver fire still flickered at her fingertips, waiting, willing. And she stood over the woman who had murdered her, who had murdered the old king who had stolen a life and ruled a kingdom from behind a stolen face, who had watched Sorsha bleed to death and smiled the whole way through it. One word, one gesture of silver flame. It would be so easy. It would be justice. Every soul in this kingdom would call it justice. Her wolf wanted it. God, how her wolf wanted it. All those vows, sworn to an empty room, pulled toward the simple, righteous, final thing. And Sorsha stood at the edge of it, and looked down, and saw not a spider, but the girl underneath the one the mask had slipped and shown her, sold, and sent away, and set aside, worth nothing to the people who should have loved her, until she'd decided the only way to be safe was to make sure no one could ever throw her away again. It didn't excuse her. Nothing excused it. But Sorsha understood, standing over her enemy, with fire in her hands, that she was standing at a fork she'd been walking toward since the moment she woke in a 16-year-old's body, swearing revenge. 2 women sold by the people who should have loved them. 2 women the world had called worthless. 2 women who'd died a kind of death and clawed their way back with a promise to never be helpless again. One of them had chosen to become the thing that hurt her. The other was about to decide whether she would do the same. "You want me to do it," Sorsha said quietly. "Don't you? You'd rather I killed you here in the fire, righteous and burning, than face what comes next." Solène's cracked lips moved. "Do it," she rasped. "You've won. Take your vengeance, little wolf. It's what you came back for." And that was the whole of it, resting on the point of a single choice. Sorsha, let the silver fire go out. It guttered in her palms and died, and she knelt. She knelt in the ashes beside the woman who had killed her, and she said the truest thing she had learned in 2 whole lifetimes. "No." Solène stared at her. "I came back for vengeance," Sorsha said. "You're right about that. I woke in my old body with your name in my mouth and murder in my heart, and I have wanted this. Wanted you. Broken. Wanted you dead. Wanted you to feel the blade the way I felt it." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were clear. "But I have watched what wanting that does to a person. I've watched it my whole second life. It's lying right here in front of me, wearing your face. And I will not let it wear mine." She rose. "You killed me to keep from being discarded. You killed a king. You stole a man's whole life to make yourself a story the world would love, because somewhere along the way, someone taught you that being loved and being safe were the same thing, and that you had to steal them, because no one would ever give them freely." Sorsha shook her head. "I'm not going to give you the death you want. I'm going to give you the thing you spent your whole life running from. You're going to be seen, all of it, in the light, in front of the whole kingdom that loved the mask you wore." She turned to Veerick and to the loyal guards now flooding into the courtyard. Real ones, the ones who'd been freed the instant the seal shattered, blinking like men, waking from a long, strange sleep. "Bind her power. Don't harm her. She stands trial. For treason, for murder, for the forbidden working she used on your king." Sorsha's voice carried across the ruined courtyard, clear and final. "Let the whole realm hear what was done here. Let the invisible people who suffered under her come and speak. And then let justice be done in the open, not vengeance in the dark. We break the cycle here tonight, or we don't break it at all." Veerick looked at her for a long moment, soot-streaked, tear-streaked free. "You could have ended her," he said quietly. "No one would have blamed you. I wouldn't have." "I know." Sorsha reached for his hand. "That's exactly why I couldn't." And in the burning light of the dying green fire, the Alpha King of Valengard understood that he had been saved not by power, but by a woman who'd looked at the thing she hated most in the world and chosen deliberately not to become it. The truth came out slowly in the weeks that followed, the way truth does when it's been buried for a lifetime. Solen's crimes were laid bare in an open court before nobles and commoners both. The forged confessions, the stolen decisions, the murder of an old king dressed up as a hunting accident. And one by one, the invisible people came and spoke, servants, omegas, the discarded and the overlooked. The ones a golden woman had been certain would never be believed. They were believed. Sorsha saw to that. She sat beside the king through every day of it, and every time a trembling voice from the bottom of the palace found the courage to speak, she thought, "This is what breaking the cycle looks like. Not a blade, a witness, a person finally being seen." Lord Hedrick's part was uncovered too, his gold taken to deliver his daughter into a controlled king's hands, his knowledge of what she was walking into, his silence. He was stripped of half his lands. He escaped prison only because Sorsha asked it of the court, and she was never entirely sure why she asked. Perhaps because hatred was exhausting. Perhaps because she had already defeated the enemy that mattered and had no room left in herself to build a smaller one. And Maelis, silent, watchful. Maelis, who had carried the key to everything against her own heart for a lifetime, stood in that open court and told her story in the language of her hands with Sorsha at her side, speaking the words aloud, and a whole kingdom learned that its salvation had been kept safe all those years by a mute scullery child no one had ever thought to look at twice. "You should have a place at court," Veerick told the girl. "A place of honor. Name it." But Maelis shook her head. She had a different idea, and she signed it slowly so there could be no mistake. "I want a house. For the invisible ones. The discarded. A place where the ones no one counts can learn they are worth counting." She looked at Sorsha. "She taught me that. Let me teach it to others." And so it was built a hall in the heart of Valengard, where the lowest of the kingdom's people came to be healed and taught, and most of all, seen. Sorsha's whole strange gift, the silver fire that had grown from 3 years of small mercies, found its true work there. Not in war, in healing, in the slow, patient, unglamorous labor of picking people up. 3 months later, the kingdom of Valengard gathered for a royal wedding. It was nothing like the quiet, political arrangement of Sorsha's first life. This was a celebration that spilled into the streets. Flowers thrown from every window, music from dawn till dark. Commoners invited to the cathedral alongside nobles. A revolution in itself, a thing the old guard called scandalous, and the people called the first true joy the palace had known in a generation. Sorcha stood before her mirror in the bridal chamber in a gown of deep silver that matched the king's eyes, winter roses woven through her auburn hair. And for the first time in either of her lives, she looked at her own reflection and did not see a girl waiting to be chosen. She saw a woman who had chosen herself first, and then freely this. Brindis was there, having made the long, cold journey north the moment word reached her. She had adjusted the train with hands that had buried 2 husbands and never once gone still, and her walnut face was wet. "Your grandmother would weep to see you," she said, "the good kind of weeping. You came all this way. Try and have stopped me." A knock, and Lord Hedrick in the doorway changed, diminished an old man who'd been shown the whole ugly shape of himself in an open court and had not been able to look away. "Daughter." He bowed stiff and uncertain. "You look well." "Father." She did not rise. Some wounds heal slow, and some heal never, and she had made her peace with the difference. "You came to say something. Say it." "I came to apologize." The words came hard, like they'd been dug up from somewhere deep and unwilling. "I knew what she was, what was being done to the king. I told myself it didn't matter that you were only a daughter, only a means to gold and standing. I was wrong. I have been wrong your whole life." He could not meet her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to hear it, and to know I am proud of the woman you became, in spite of me, never because of me." He bowed again and left. Sorcha sat with it a moment. It didn't fix anything. It didn't have to. Some things you accept without letting them close the wound, and that, too, was a kind of healing, the kind that doesn't pretend. Then she rose, smoothed her silver gown, and went to be married. The cathedral overflowed. She walked the long aisle alone, no father to give her away, not in any way that meant anything, and she did not feel lonely for a single step of it. Because Veerick waited at the altar in black and silver, his pale hair braided through with threads that caught the candlelight like frost. And when he saw her, the last of the cold king fell away entirely, and what remained was a man so full of a love he'd been forbidden to feel for a lifetime that Sorcha felt her own chest ache with it. She reached him, took his hands. "You came," he whispered. "Did you think I wouldn't?" I thought I might wake and find it was a dream, that you were still gone, that I was still trapped in the fog, and only imagining a world where you'd forgiven me." "You're awake." She squeezed his warm fingers. "I'm here, and neither of us is trapped anymore." When the vows came, Veerick spoke first. "I made a vow once," he said, and a ripple of confusion moved through the crowd, who didn't understand. "In a life you remember, and I've only just been given back. I don't recall the words, but I know the shape of what I felt every cold day of it, that I was reaching for something through a window I couldn't break." He lifted her hand to his lips. "Today I make a different vow. I will love you out loud, without fear, without restraint, where the whole world can see it. I will never again let anyone stand between us or speak with my mouth or turn my face away from yours. And if death itself tries to part us again, I will do what you did. I will find my way back to you, however long it takes, however far." Tears ran down her face. She didn't wipe them. My turn, she managed. She took a breath. I swore a vow once too, she said, to an empty room, in pain and grief and rage. I swore I would never love you again. A soft broken laugh moved through her. I meant it with my whole heart, and I have never in my life been so glad to break a promise. She reached up and touched his face. I've learned that love isn't so easily killed. It survives lies. It survives a lifetime of fog. It survives death, and it survives coming back. I loved you in a life where you couldn't love me back. I love you in this one now that you can. And I'll love you in every life that comes after, no matter what tries to keep us apart. The priest pronounced them wed, and when Varric kissed her, the whole cathedral rose in a roar of joy that shook the white stone to its foundations. 5 years later, Sorsha stood in the nursery, watching her twins sleep. A boy and a girl, silver-haired like their father, amber-eyed like their mother. They'd been born on the coldest night of winter, and their first cries had come with a freak snowfall that blanketed the whole kingdom, white and soft, as if winter itself had come to bless them instead of curse them. For once. Varric appeared in the doorway, still in his council robes, exhaustion in every line of him. But when he saw her, his whole face softened. "They're sleeping," she whispered. "A miracle." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "How long do we have? An hour, maybe 2. Then come with me." He led her through the palace to the balcony above the kingdom. Vihalengard spread below them, glittering with light. The people were celebrating. They were always celebrating now, in a realm that had spent a generation under a quiet frost and had finally fully thawed. Trade flourished. Magic, once forbidden and feared, was studied and honored and put to work healing instead of harming. And in the heart of the city, lit warm against the winter dark, stood Maelis's Hall, the house for the invisible ones, where every night the discarded of the kingdom learned the thing Sorsha had spent 2 lifetimes learning herself. "I've been thinking," Varric said. "Dangerous pastime." He laughed that easy, real laugh that still, after 5 years, made her heart lift. "About the day we met, the second time, when you refused to dance with me. The day I ruined all your plans. The day you saved my life, and I didn't even know it needed saving." He turned her to face him. "I've thought about it 1,000 times. She had me so completely, every thought, every choice, for as long as I could remember. And then a girl in mourning. Black looked me in the eye and told me no, and something underneath all her working. Something she never managed to reach. It woke up. It recognized you." His hands framed her face. "Even buried alive in my own head, some part of me knew you were the way out." Sorsha leaned into his touch. "In my first life," she said quietly, "I thought love was about how much you could give up. I thought if I just sacrificed enough, my magic, my family, my whole self, it would finally be enough to be loved back. I gave until there was nothing left, and it still wasn't enough because you can't buy love with your own erasure." "It was never your sacrifice that mattered," Varric said. "It was her theft. She took everything from us. But she couldn't take this." He kissed her forehead. "She couldn't take who you chose to be when you had every reason to become her instead." They stood together in the cold, clean air, watching the lights of the kingdom, and somewhere far to the south, in a bound and quiet cell, Solène lived out her days, her power, broken her crimes, known her name spoken by the people, not with love, but with the plain truth of what she'd done. She had wanted to be a story the world would kneel to. Instead, she'd become a story the world would learn from. which was perhaps its own kind of justice, the kind that doesn't need a blade. Sorcha rarely thought of her anymore. The past was the past. Both of her pasts. What mattered was here. The husband who loved her out loud. The children who carried their legacy. The hall in the city where the forgotten came to be remembered. The kingdom that had welcomed a twice-dead wolf as its queen, not because she'd conquered it, but because she'd healed it. "I love you," she said, as simple as breathing. "I love you too." He pulled her closer. In this life, and every one that follows, she had sworn once in the wreckage of her own murder that she would never love him again. She had sworn to keep her heart locked away, safe from the man who'd let her die. But some vows are made to be broken, and some loves are simply too stubborn and too true to stay buried in any grave. The harvest moon gathering was where desperate families brought their daughters to be chosen. Sorcha had been brought there to be sold, traded, discarded in the end like a glove worn through. Except she had learned the one thing they never wanted her to know. That being unwanted by the people who should have loved you does not make you unworthy of love itself. That your worth was never theirs to set. That a woman the world throws away can pick herself up and pick up everyone the world threw away beside her and build something out of all that discarded gold that shines brighter than any throne. She had been reborn. She had refused. She had fought. And in the end, she had won not by becoming harder than the world that broke her, but by staying soft in the one place that counted and choosing again and again mercy over the blade. She had chosen herself, and then freely with her eyes open and her heart her own,